So Donald Trump has been president for 2 weeks and 1 day. He's been very, very busy. But he hasn't ended the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, as he said he would, and I don't think he's met yet with Putin. Although there was an interesting story today about Russia to Trump back off Ukraine's rare earths. There was an interesting story about Russia, Trump offering to help Ukraine if they gave him some of their minerals. What do you think is going to be the relationship between the two of them in terms of, is it a rerun of Trump's first term with Russia? Do you think it's different, and if so, how? Maybe I'll start with Roman.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for making the time and coming. I know it's raining outside and it's hard weather. When we think about what Trump and Putin will decide about Ukraine and what their relationship look like, well, first of all, of course, we don't know what are the relationship of two people except themselves, but we can look at the key factors, or as they say here at Stanford, at the key parameters of dysfunction. And what are those key parameters? Well, first of all, I believe that Trump and Putin share a lot of psychological traits. They're both narcissistic, and they need admiration. They both share those traits of Machiavellianism, when they, don't care about, they really don't care about what other people, the sufferings of other people, and they try to perceive and achieve the power by doing whatever they want. So what I'm trying to say is that they both are very similar psychologically. And the second important thing is that I believe that for Trump, Ukraine is not a top priority. And he really, I believe that he wants to make this deal as soon as possible and concentrate on something that is more important for him, like Canada, Greenland, or China, or other things, which makes me think that this deal will unfortunately not be that beneficial for Ukraine and in the short term, let alone in the long term. Yeah.
So, Michael, do you think, thank you, do you think that there would be negotiations about the war in Ukraine with Trump and Putin? Do you think there'll be negotiations? What do you see possibly going forward?
Well, first, thank you for having me. And I want to say two other things by way of introduction. One of my friends who teaches here at Stanford, when he starts his class, he says, you have to come to every class, except I will allow for excused absences. And one of those excused absences here at Stanford is if it's raining. So the fact that we have such a great crowd, given how badly it's raining, because normal behavior on this campus, we should just have 3 people here. Second, I just want to say before we get into this, I want to say thank you to JSK. For me personally, I have learned a ton from the people you've brought here, including this guy right here, the last time he was here. Going back decades, Dawn, you introduced me to a Ukrainian journalist, Alyona Pritula, that literally changed the trajectory of my research. I began working on Ukraine, and I ended up writing a book, largely because I met Alyona about the Orange Revolution. This is a book about 20 years ago. She was the founder, one of the co-founders of Ukrainska Pravda, and there's a long drama, but she is a historic figure, like many of the people that you have had here. And the other piece is you enrich our community here at Stanford. Our students here at FSI, the fellows, I want you to know that it is a great thing that we have your program here at Stanford. And it should double its size and increase its funding.
Okay, thank you.
Now,
thank you, Michael.
To your question, I mean, the first answer is, whenever I'm asked a question about Mr. Trump, President Trump, my answer is, I don't know. And that's part of the mystery of working in the, thinking about the new Trump era, because it changes a lot. The second thing, to build on the answer about first Trump versus second Trump, there have been slight differences already. Last week, to the best of my knowledge, for the first time ever, and I've followed Mr. Trump and I followed Putin. Putin I've met back in 1991.
I was going to ask
so
you
we go
when you
way
met.
back. We are not Facebook friends. But we have a long history. I followed him too, and obviously I worked in the government across the table from him. But with respect to Trump, because of my job working for NBC, I had to cover him very closely and follow the things he said throughout the first 4 years. Last week was the first time ever that I have seen that President Trump or Donald Trump before him had, when he wasn't president, said something critical about Putin. And he said, "You're ruining your country." That's new. That's different. So that's a second, just data point. Mm-hmm. But to the answer about negotiations, I will be surprised if Putin and Trump sit down and negotiate. I'd also be worried if that happens, because there should not be a negotiation about the future of Ukraine without President Zelensky at the table.
Right.
And then the last thing I'll say, with what I think Roman said is very important. Yes, Trump promised, he actually promised to end it before he became president. He inaugurated, just so you know, he didn't achieve that objective.
Okay.
And then he said he was going to end it in a day, and I was, on set for inauguration, at Rockefeller Center, doing my day job with NBC, waiting for when that peace proposal was going to come out, and it didn't happen that day. So that was a bad joke. But here's the problem. He has intimated that he wants to be engaged. And I want to say, I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing. This is a horrific, barbaric invasion of Ukraine. It's not the war in Ukraine. I can't use that phrase. It's a barbaric invasion of a sovereign country. And the fact that the President of the United States has signaled that he wants to help end it, I applaud that. What I worry about are two things. One is that his idea of a great deal is just giving Putin everything he wants. And that will not end the war. I want to be crystal clear about that. I speak to Ukrainians every single day, including today. I just met with senior government officials last week. They will not accept something that Trump and Putin agree to in Helsinki, and then they say, you got to accept this deal. They won't accept that. Remember, President Zelensky is a democratically elected leader of his country, despite the propaganda trying to tarnish him right now. And he has to think about what his voters think. He also has to think about what his generals and his soldiers think. They're not going to sell out their sisters and brothers who have been killed just because Trump wants a deal with Putin. And in fact, when I talk to some of my friends close to President Zelensky, they worry that if he accepted that deal, there could be a coup attempt against President Zelensky. So this idea that these two guys can just come together and agree to whatever they want without the Ukrainians involved is a non-starter. And the last thing I'll say on the deal part of it, I worry what you just said. He'll try a little bit, and then he'll figure out this is going to be hard, and Putin isn't not actually my buddy, and he's not going to just do what I tell him, and I can't use, we've seen a lot of bully ball, in the last couple of weeks, using coercive diplomacy, I'll put it in more diplomatic terms, to tell the, various small countries what to do, Panama, Colombia, and that works. You can, tragically, you can do that. I don't think it works in the long term, but you can tell small countries what to do and threaten them, Mexico and Canada to that list. That's not going to work with Vladimir Putin, in part because we don't have that leverage. President Trump said the other day, if he doesn't do a deal, we're going to have to start putting tariffs on Russian goods coming into America. He obviously said that without looking at the trade data, because we don't trade with the Russians. And I shouldn't have said that. I'm being too flippant. It's been a long day. But what I fear analytically, just that he'll try and he'll send his special envoy, and there won't be a deal. And then he'll walk away because he's got these other priorities, and the Ukrainians would be left, tragically, I predict, fighting for a much longer period. I hope I'm wrong. I really do. I hope I'm wrong, though.
Yeah. Roman, what do you just said about what are Putin's priorities, do you think?
Well, what people don't understand about him, I believe, is that he has an ideology. I've heard it so many times from many experts, Western experts and Russian experts, that he's just a corrupt leader who only cares about building another palace, which I believe is not true. And I'm not acquainted with him personally, but when I was in Russia and I specialized in secret services, I've met many KGB officers who served with him in Germany and in Leningrad. And I actually see in everything he does and everything he says, those things that I was told by his colleagues. So they do have an ideology, and it's a very nasty ideology. It's built on those, I would call it dark triad pillars, which means that they don't care about other nations, and they also suffer from a very dangerous syndrome, Versailles syndrome, because they see themselves as soldiers of the Cold War, the war that they lost, and they will never forget this humiliation. And of course, everything that he does, not only with Ukraine, but with Moldova, Georgia, Baltic countries, and other states, is his attempt to regain this influence and to show the US that, these are our spheres of interest, and you don't dare to challenge them. And that is why I do agree with Michael that he will not stop in Ukraine. I mean, of course, he needs some kind of break right now because the Russian army is exhausted. His resources are also exhausted. And, in order to continue a full-scale invasion in Ukraine or any other country, they will need to rebuild the army, which they're planning to do. Because if you look at, people he appoints in Russia, if you look at his priorities, if you look at the goals that they state publicly, he's actually he's not hiding his intentions. Even before the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the guy said, my goal is to rewrite the global order. And that's what he does.
Can I just double down on this point? Because I think it's so important. I hope we don't agree on everything tonight, but we might. But this point about ideology, I just want to echo what you said. I think it's so important. I think it's one of the things we in the United States, I'm not going to speak for the entire Western world, but least understand about Putin. When I was in the government, I went to 100 meetings with very senior administration officials, including my boss, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, where I would hear people talk, he's just transactional. He's just transactional. We just got to do deals with him. He's just a thug. He's just a criminal. We could try to treat him like a criminal. And I think you can be transactional and a thug and an ideologue all at the same time. This notion that you're one or the other, I think, is wrong. And I think we've made a lot of mistakes in how we've dealt with Putin because we didn't think in the terms of
what is even surprising that when Putin publicly postulates his ideology, like he did in 2023 at the World Congress of the Russian People, where he actually, postulated all the principles of his ideology, people were still saying like, oh, it's nonsense. He doesn't mean what he says. But I mean, it's ridiculous. The guy is doing what he says. The guy is doing what he believes. So we gotta really, if you want to understand Putin and his next steps, we need to understand his ideology and we need to understand what they believe.
You told me a really kind of scary story when we were preparing for this about, that talking about Putin's ideology and how there were parades of kindergartners in military outfits, and you at first thought, well, that's ridiculous. Tell us a little bit about what you saw and how you think that feeds into what he is trying to do with his country.
Well, they are starting to indoctrinate children from the kindergartens, where people from the veterans from the front line, they come to those kids who are 4 years old, and they are telling them, they dress them in the military uniform, and they teach them, how to use weapons, and they boast about killing Ukrainians in Ukraine. And for me, it's obvious what they are doing and what kind of generation they are preparing, because I remember myself in 2005 and 2006, how we were laughing at those ridiculous parades on the Victory Day, 9th of May, when all the schools around the country were dressed up in the military uniform. They organized those parades in, toy tanks and other armored vehicles, and we were like, oh, it sounds ridiculous. But 15 years later, these boys who were dressed in those military uniforms, they grew up, and now they support Putin, and now they fight in Ukraine, and some of them believe in his ideology, others do it for money, but still they do it. And it means that he was strategic, even though it looked for us funny. He was strategic, and he managed to raise this generation of young Russians who support him and who are ready to fight.
Yeah, thank you. I want to shift to the other guy, Trump, for a moment. Roman, and I'll start with you, and then I have another question for you, Michael. What is the impact of Trump's decisions on journalists all over the world? Do his decisions influence your work? And then please tell us a little bit about your work and what you do.
Well, I mean, of course they do. The impact is huge, and not only on us, but on my colleagues all over the world. So I just recently talked to my amazing colleagues from Ukraine, the head of and the founder of probably the most important and prominent investigative media outlet called Slidstvo. And I know that, I mean, well, they don't have any other sources of funding rather than from donors, because the economy is ruined by Russia. You know, they are constantly being bombed. And I know that 80% of their budget is frozen because the US played a crucial role in this industry. And it's not happening only in Ukraine, but in other countries as well, from Macedonia to Brazil. We, as iStories, we were not getting any direct funding from the US government or USAID. But since, again, the US played such a crucial role, some of our European funders, donors, they froze 30% of our budget. And I mean, my job is to actually substitute this gap, because if I don't do that, I will have to lay people off. But again, I mean, we're not in the worst situation when you look at what's going on with our colleagues in other parts of the world.
Right. So are you hearing, Michael, about how Trump's decisions are affecting Ukraine and affecting people here in the United States on foreign policy focus?
Well, the executive decree, I shouldn't use that word, executive order, that's what we call them. That feels a little bit like, I'm going to be more serious. That is frozen, and
yeah.
I serve on boards of 2 organizations that have their accounts frozen, just like you described. One's in Kiev, and it's called the National Democratic Institute. It's a major NGO around the world that supports democracy all over the world, and their accounts are frozen now. And many other groups, I don't want to name them, I'll let them put out their own press releases, but NGOs, I know people that support independent media around the world, people that support civil societies, people that support anti-corruption groups. All of those accounts are frozen now in Ukraine, and those that support Russian groups in exile, Belarusian groups, Iranian groups, Chinese groups, they're all frozen. And Mr. Musk just the other day said that the National Endowment for Democracy, by the way, that I think, if I'm not mistaken, gave the initial grant to start Ukrainska Pravda back when I met Alyona 20-odd years ago, that helped, you know, the founder was assassinated, and then that helped to launch, in part, the Orange Revolution. He said, I'm paraphrasing now, and I know I'm with some journalists, so don't quote me, but he said, "Ned is a scam," I think is the phrase. So there is this assault on foreign assistance, and I'm just talking about the world I know. I'm not talking about humanitarian assistance. I'm not talking about you know, the medical assistance. That's where most of USAID's money goes, by the way, if you can go and look at their websites. But you can't go look at their websites right now because they're all blocked. And just as a, you know, I know some of these characters working on this stuff, and they're really sensitive about First Amendment and the censorship industrial complex. You've heard them talk about that. Well, I'm a U.S. taxpayer. I pay, my money is spent for that website, and I went and looked at it, tried to get on it last night, and I can't get on it. That is a paradox. I'll just try to be more diplomatic. But I think it is just, it's just so short-sighted. I mean, it's obvious to me that those taking these actions have not studied this question closely. You can't become an expert in foreign assistance all over the world in 2 weeks. It's more complex than that. And I want to be crystal clear. Should there be reform of USAID? Absolutely. I've written dozens of articles about it. I wrote a whole book about democracy assistance 12 years ago with ideas for major reform. And I'm happy to get into the details if you want to. I applaud that. Is there inefficiency? Yes. Is there too much money spent on Americans and not on NGOs? Yes, of course. But shutting everything down, laying off people, and then they'll have to shut down NGOs. That is not the right way to do it, in part because who is celebrating this? You know who's celebrating? Do you know who tweeted about it last night? I'm blocked, so somebody sent it to me. A guy named Dmitry Medvedev. He used to be president of Russia when I was the ambassador. Well, I was at the White House, and then he segued out to let Putin. Dmitry Medvedev is celebrating. You know who else is celebrating it? Folks affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party. So if those are the people celebrating, shouldn't that be a signal that maybe this is not such a great idea? And then the last thing I'll just say, we are in a competition for the next several decades, which I think we are, with autocratic great powers, China first, Russia, Iran, North Korea, that axis of illiberal autocracies. We have to have our full arsenal. We have to have all of our instruments of influence at play. When was USAID created? 1961, the height of the Cold War. President Kennedy created it. Why did he create it? It wasn't just because he wanted to, peace, love, and understanding. That was part of it. But it was for competition with the Soviets. The history is very clear. Again, the website, if you can get to it later, it tells that history. And the Chinese, they're not shutting down their foreign assistance around the world. They're not shutting down the Belt and Road Initiative. They're not shutting down AIB. We have no chance to compete for the things that we at least the things I care about, if we take away this instrument of American foreign policy and American soft power.
So one site, I totally agree with you, one site that is not taken down, which is quite important for this conversation, is iStories. And I want to talk a bit, Roman, about your organization. So you were a fellow in 2019 and came here and decided after, I don't know how long after your fellowship.
Actually, I decided it's at the end of the fellowship.
Okay, do you want to tell that story a little bit? And then I have a question about how you do your work now.
Yes, so when I came to Stanford, I was still working for Novaya Gazeta, being the head of investigations. But in 2019 or 2020, when was the time to go back to Russia, I realized that there was no ideal media outlet where I would like to go back. And I thought that, well, maybe it was the only moment in my life when I had a chance to try to create my own ideal media outlet, and that's how iStories actually appeared. And the name was really, the way I came to this name was simple. It was like, what this media was going to be about. It's going to be about important stories. That's how we started. And in the beginning, we were this classic investigative media outlet. We were based in Moscow. There were 9 of us. And we focused mainly on corruption and organized crime. And we did a couple of really big stories. One of them was about Putin's son-in-law, and that was the second time when Putin had to comment my story. The first time when I published Panama Papers. And what is interesting is that when we published Panama Papers, he said, it was a plot by the CIA, and this story was written by lawyers and not by journalists, although I wrote the story myself with these own hands. And the second time when he commented my story, he said, I know these guys, and they work for the CIA, so there is no need to comment the story. So 4 months later, after we published the story, people from the FSB and the investigative committee came to my apartment. They raided my apartment, the office of iStories. And even before that, I had a planned vacation, and I went to Ukraine, to Kyiv, and my favorite Odessa. This is where my parents left, and this is where everything started. And it was the last time when I visited Ukraine. And then when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started, I had to relocate the whole newsroom, and it was a difficult psychologically time for us because we had to change everything, and we were thinking what we got to do next. And we thought that it was our responsibility as Russian citizens, when our country started such a horrible, I do agree, horrible invasion. It was our responsibility to somehow react. And we decided to focus on a number of topics. First of all, we focused on investigating the atrocities of the Russian army. And despite being in exile, we've achieved some really important impact. So 4 of our stories are already being used as an official evidence in the investigations by the ICC and the Ukrainian prosecutor's office against Putin, Maria Lvova-Belova, and others, especially in the investigation about the illegal deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia. So we actually provided evidence to the ICC, and the reason why, the way we do it is really interesting. We combine these modern approaches to investigations, because part of our team, the majority of our team are coders, and they were able to code some significant data from Russia and get this evidence. We also investigate how Russia, smuggles components to produce arms, and we recently calculated that more than 30 entities and individuals were added to sanctions list following our investigations.
Congratulations.
And last but not least, we achieve impact even inside the country, inside Russia. So we do investigations. We focus on videos because YouTube is still the most popular platform inside the country. And what we try to do is we try to go to distant regions and talk to plain Russians who live in those regions, so that they tell us their stories, how they suffer from poverty, war, and so on. And sometimes the stories are being very popular. I'll give you just one example. We went to a remote village that didn't have a centralized water supply for 200 years.
For 200 years?
Yes,
okay.
Since the village was established, it didn't have a centralized water supply. So we came to this village and we just, did a regional mini documentary about how this village lives, about the war, and so on. So the story was viewed by, I believe, 1.5 million people. And the very next day after we published the story, the local authorities had to react, and they started building the pipeline to this village. Admitting, of course, that the whole story is a plot by the CIA and the ES, but simultaneously they had to react. We had other stories that were viewed by dozens of millions of people, and when we looked at the statistics, we saw that these stories were viewed by 60% of people living in Krasnodar, or half of 50% of people living in Irkutsk. These are the major regional cities, and I believe this is the only, or not the only, but probably the best approach. Because if you look at the statistics in Russia, you will have two extreme groups of people, those who support the war and those who oppose the war, and they kind of equal. But those people who are in between, I believe that our job is to try to influence these people so that they shift to those who oppose the war, and thus maybe change the perception of the whole country of what's going on.
So you mentioned about different viewpoints inside of Russia, of course. What is the mood, do you think, in Russia right now, or moods of people, just about the situation that they are in? Do they feel like, yes, we're winning that war in Ukraine, or we don't care about that, or we're worried because people are coming home in body bags that we know?
If you look at the sociology, and I know that there are many critics about those numbers, and there are many questions whether you can rely on sociology during the wartime, I still believe that you can, because we go to those remote villages and towns and cities, and we talk to people, and we see that actually those numbers are close to reality. So the sociology says that, as I said, there are two extreme groups. The one, which I call the bloodthirsty supporters of the war, these are people who actually think that it's a good idea to throw a nuclear bomb on Kyiv and just, finish the war as quickly as possible. And you can't really do anything to them, because unfortunately, once people are indoctrinated by propaganda, there is not so much you can do. This is not my opinion. This is just the scientific evidence. The only thing you can do actually is what some researchers show, that you can give people what they call a shot of truth. So once people get the shot of truth before they are exposed to propaganda, they're less likely to believe in propaganda. And that is why I believe it's so important to focus on younger people in Russia, because Russia will still exist. And if we want to change something inside the country, if we want to at least save the hope inside the country that one day Russia will, I don't say will become a democratic state, but will either become a state with which you can live, with which you can have a common border, you gotta focus on young people and work with them. And that's what we try to do. But the majority of people in Russia, I wouldn't say that they are big supporters of the war, and I wouldn't say that they are strong opponents of the war. They live with this apathy. They're sick with apathy rather than with hatred. And this is the worst thing about propaganda. It doesn't make you believe in something. It makes you believe nothing. And you know, I remember when the war started, people were asking this question, what can we do? And today that question has transformed into a statement, we can't really do anything. This apathy is something that is really hard to deal with. But this is the reality that we have to face.
Right. Thank you. Michael, I was going to ask you, changing gears a bit. So you met Putin when first?
Spring of 1991.
So, granted, you're here and not there now, but what have you seen in how he was when you were there as an ambassador, and what do you see of him now? What can you tell? Has he changed a lot? Do you feel like, what is the Putin of today?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't have a great answer. I'm interested in your answer to that question. I want to be clear. I met him very briefly in the spring of 1991. By the way, working for the NGO that I just mentioned earlier. I was working at the time for the National Democratic Institute. There had just been a wave of elections in the Soviet Union in the spring of 1990 at the republic, provincial, city, and sub-city level. And there were big breakthroughs. The Russian Federation broke through, that got a small majority by 4 votes, and that's when Boris Yeltsin became the head of the Presidium, became the chairman of the Russian, what's it called now, in Congress of People's Deputies. Thank you, Catherine. I was thinking the Russian, I couldn't remember the English. But then there were the elections at the Mosssoviet and the Lensoviet, the Moscow City Council and the St. Petersburg City Council, big majorities in support of Democrats. And there was this really charismatic mayor that was elected in St. Petersburg. His name was Anatoly Sobchak. His daughter then became a journalist. I'll let you describe what she is, whether that's the right, there's a lot of journalists in this room. I'm going to let Roman answer whether she's a journalist or not. That's a very loaded description I just gave her, Ksenia. But we're there, and our job is to work with, democratic forces around the world. And I want to be crystal clear about this, because there's a lot of propaganda about groups like NDI. We were invited by these groups to work with them. And then after the Soviet Union collapsed, and I went back in the summer of 1992 to open the offices of NDI in Moscow, the first time ever, we were invited by the government, the democratically elected government of Russia. We were not fomenting revolution. I'll come back to that in a minute. But the only reason I met Putin was we were there to work with Sobchak, and we brought over a bunch of city council members from Los Angeles and New York to talk about how you pass a budget in a transparent way. And the head of foreign contacts for Anatoly Sobchak was this guy named Putin. And that's how I met him. And had you asked me back then, name 5,000 people that might be the future president of Russia, he would not have made my list. He was not a very interesting guy. So I didn't know him well during the 90s. I know a lot of people that knew him well. And I've written about him. I wrote, the first article I wrote about Putin was in 2000. It's my impression, but I haven't studied the question, and I'm interested in what Roman says, or there's lots of people in this room might have views on this. My impression of the guy was, of course, he's from the KGB, right? He's from that group of people. And he lamented the collapse of the Soviet Union. I celebrated it. He lamented it. Although he worked for a guy that also celebrated it. And he's in August 1991, just so you know, he's in all the shots with Sobchak saying, we're fighting the coup. So that's confusing to me, because some people say that knew him back then that actually he was for change. I can't speak to that because I didn't know him back then.
Yeah.
But I know 2 things about his previous history and then what happened later that I experienced firsthand. One, he did believe in relations with the West, and he talked about being a member of NATO, and then September 11th happened, and that was a moment in time where he thought that the United States and Russia had a common enemy in terrorism, and he bonded with our president at the time, George W. Bush, to fight this common enemy. I think that was real, at least in talking to the Bush administration officials, including, well, I shouldn't say that, we're on the record. In talking with Bush administration officials, including very senior ones that live in Texas, there was a sense that this was, that there were common things. And, you know, for the Americans in the room, you remember what a time that was for our country, and Putin was with us, right, in the global war on terrorism. And then, you know, there was NATO expansion. People make a lot of that. I don't think that really mattered to him back when it was announced in 2002. And even the Iraq War that people make a lot of fuss about. I was in the meeting with President Obama and then Prime Minister Putin when they talked about the mistakes of the Bush administration. This is in the summer of 2009 out at Putin's compound. And the way he talked about it was not like he was really pissed off about it. It was just like, we wanted to work with you guys, and you didn't respect us. You didn't bring us in. So he felt like he wasn't part of that inner club. And that chip on his shoulder has been there ever since. But the real thing that turned him was not those events. It was, you know, the fall of Milosevic in 2000, the Georgian Rose Revolution in 2003, and then the really big one, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. When in Putin's mind, and I've heard him speak about this at length, directly, those were, in his views, I want to be crystal clear, his flawed, wrong view. But in his view, those were revolutions that we orchestrated. The deep state.
We, the United States.
We, the CIA. And he even has this kind of deep state thing that he can bond over from time to time with our current president. You know, presidents come and go, but it's this deep state that controls things, right? The CIA, the Pentagon, the Siloviki, you know, he uses that language. And by the way, I'm a part of it, in his view. You think I'm a professor at Stanford. No, I'm not. I'm part of this group. And you know why he believes that? Because that's the way his regime runs. And so he's mirroring, of course, it's got to be the KGB types that's running everything. People come and go. You know, Yeltsin was there, but they were running things. That's his view. And that's when he flipped. I really think that's true. And we had this conversation, President Obama and Prime Minister had this conversation when he was like rolling out this theory of American power. And Obama, by the way, just for the journalists in the room, I was pretty new to the government at the time. This is July 2009. I just joined in January. And this was my first time ever that I was the SAO for this meeting, the senior administration official that was going to read out to our White House press corps that was sitting down in the kitchen waiting for the readout, right? And I was super nervous about it. You know, journalists make me nervous. They still do. And the meeting was scheduled for an hour, right? And 58 minutes into the meeting, my guy, President Obama, had not said a word yet. President Obama, whether you like him or not, politics aside, the guy knows how to listen. He does listen. And he's just listening the whole time. And I'm freaking out that the meeting is going to end in 2 minutes. And I'm going to go to the White House press corps and say, well, what did they talk about? And I have to say, well, the President of the United States just listened to a lecture from Putin. Thankfully, it went for 3.5 hours because they had a lot to say. But you know, Putin went on this thing explaining his worldview and, you know, you're out to get us. And at the end of this, President Obama said, well, you know, I understand your view, right? But I'm different. And he said, you may not know this, but I was against the war in Iraq. Way before it was popular to be against the war in Iraq. I was against that war. We're going to be different. And he said that. I remember, and Putin's like listening into him and looking at. And remember, I speak Russian, or I used to speak Russian, so I could hear what he was saying twice. And then we walked out to the cars, and I could tell he's like thinking, well, maybe this guy is different, right? He talks different. He looks different than the last guy. He acts different. He's listening a lot, and they got out, and I could tell he's like thinking, well, maybe things are going to be different. But then from Putin's worldview, what happens 18 months later? In our view, I worked at the White House at the time. Some young, incredibly courageous people starting in Tunisia and then in Egypt and then other parts of the Arab world sparked something back then we called the Arab Spring. And I want to be crystal clear about this. I worked at the National Security Council at the time. We had nothing to do with that. We wanted the Arab Spring like a hole in our head at the time, because we were running these plays with Russia and China. We didn't want this Arab Spring. That was, I call them small D Democrats with no control from us at the White House situation. We had no control of those people. I knew some of them. We had no control of them. But for Putin, here it is. Deep state's running their play again. And they're fooling us this time. They're so creative this time. They're overthrowing their own guy, Mubarak, because that's how clever they are, right? That's how clever they are in running this. And I think that moment for him, and then, I'm sorry to go on about this ancient history, but then, just a little bit later, you know what happens? The same year in 2011, Bolotnaya, in your country, same thing. A falsified election. I'm telling you honestly, I should be careful. You might not be surprised that for Russian experts, because I was in the government, but there's some Russian experts here, that when we looked at the level of falsification in 2011 in the parliamentary election, it was like no big deal, 5, 6, 7%. That's just a typical Russian election. There was no great reaction from us. But there was in your country. And you should tell the story. And, first it was reporters, and it was journalists, and it was NGOs, and then it was, that information circulated on the internets. That's a word I use on purpose to show how old I am. And later, giant demonstrations against Putin that started out to say we want to have a free and fair election, but then, they started cheering Russia без Putina, right? Russia without Putin. And in his mind, that was all us. All us. And when I arrived, I want to be clear about this. Correlation is not causation. I arrived 3 weeks after that as the U.S. ambassador. And, when I arrived, first as propagandist, and later he personally said, we know that you're here to foment this revolution. And no amount of, explanation was going to get him off of that. And so I actually do think there was an evolution. And then he just doubled down on this nationalist, orthodox, illiberal stuff. He's really obsessed with sex, by the way. I mean, Roman, you know more than I do. But all that kind of stuff, we're not part of the West. We're not part of that gay Europa. That's a phrase, it's his phrase, not mine. And, that was a long time ago, but tragically, in lots of countries in Europe and in my own country, there are people with a similar ideological orientation that makes him feel like, he was right to move in that direction. Sorry for the long answer, but it's an important question. But I want to hear your answer about, did he ever evolve, or was he always just a...
No, absolutely. First of all, I think you're so right when you say that he doesn't believe in free will. He believes that everything, there is always a conspiracy. He doesn't believe that the world is ruled by a chance or luck, but, by a conspiracy. And that's what I experienced with my articles. Every time when I published something, it wasn't because I'm a journalist and I'm doing my job. It was because, the CIA told me, or, aliens told me, or whoever told me. Then when you look at his evolution, I agree that the first key point was 2004, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And if you look at his public speeches, the first time he mentioned the phrase, the Russian world, like an ideology, was 2 years later. And he said, please remember these words, because you're going to hear them a lot. It was 2006. 2 years later, he invaded Georgia, and, well, let's admit it, there was no proper reaction from the West. And the guy, realized that he achieved what he wanted. For him, it was a successful, very successful operation. Then, you're absolutely right, 2011, starting from the Arab Spring, and then Bolotnaya. In 2012, when he got back to the Kremlin, again, he publicly admitted that the very first thing that he's going to do, he's going to change everything politically. And that's when he started bringing his bodyguards into power, because he thought that 2011, the protest in 2011 was a coup against him, and he didn't even trust his own law enforcement, and that is why he decided to promote his bodyguards, people he really trusted. 2014, Crimea, again, for him it was a very successful operation, which of course started even before with Maidan, which he thought was orchestrated by the US. And it explains a lot why he actually decided to start a full-scale invasion against Ukraine. Well, first of all, of course, he relied on really bad information that was coming from bad sources, mainly, people from the Yanukovych circle who ran to Russia and who wanted to go back. But simultaneously, if you look at things in 2022 by the eyes of the dictator, he's been successful in all his military campaigns. Why wouldn't he start it once again? Yes, I mean, I agree that he evolved a lot during those 25 years in power. And we should not forget that people change psychologically when they're constantly being told that they are the best and they are here with a mission to save the country and to make it great again. And
we don't know anything about what that's like.
Can I just add one thing on this?
Yes.
I'd like to add lots of things, but how about two things?
Okay.
One, this circle thing I think is really important. Over time, when Putin came in, he was an accidental president, right? That's a complicated story, which we don't have time now. But he didn't know how to run the economy, and so he had these people around him. These are some people I know well, that were his, the oversimplification is the liberal technocrats were around him, and he talked to them and he listened to them. They had influence on him. They did. And by the way, they did some liberal market reforms back then. They cut income tax, flat tax of 13%. That's an idea that's been propagated. That's an idea that my colleagues at the Hoover Institution have been pushing for our country for a long, long time, and we haven't achieved it yet. And he did that, right? So think about that. Yeah. But then over time, this is a really important thing. He becomes more and more and more isolated.
And paranoid. And paranoid.
And I want to get to the paranoid was going to be my second point. So more and more isolated. Those people around him, not around him. More and more he's just hanging out with, his group is these Siloviki guys. These are people I used to interact with, Guys like Patrushev, Bortnikov. Those are the people that we are seeing are spending more and more time with him, and the German Grefs of the world, and those people not as much time. Even like a guy like Igor Shuvalov, to get into the weeds, less and less time. Then, you know what else we're noticing over time? And it's gotten worse since I was in the government. He's out at his compound. You might not be surprised if you're an American, or anybody else for that matter, that the United States government might be very interested in the way that Putin spends his day. So we devoted some resources to that answering that question. And a decade ago, he wouldn't start his day till like 11 or 12, and then he'd work out for 2 hours. He rarely came to town, folks. This is a decade ago. And so he's out there by himself. People come out to him, and as did we, by the way, drove out to see Putin. And his circle gets smaller and smaller. Then COVID happens, smaller and smaller. And then the people around him are just telling him how great he is. Also, in parallel to that, he had peers back 25 years ago in the world. Berlusconi, say what you want about him, Schroeder, even President Bush, people that could talk to, he thinks he only has one peer today, that's Xi Jinping. And by the way, I don't think that relationship's so great. I think Putin is not getting what he wants out of the Chinese. But then the second thing I wanted to say is about paranoia, and I'll say it with an anecdote because I'm talking too much. We keep saying conspiracy and threatening him, and there is no conspiracy. I was not running a CIA operation to overthrow Putin. That's categorically not true. The things they've said about you are not true. But one of my Russian friends when I was ambassador said something that really stuck with me. And he said, Mike, don't be naive. You are threatening to Putin. Me personally. He said, you are threatening to Putin. I was like, come on, man, what are you talking about? And he said, because you do believe in freedom. You do believe in human rights. You do believe in the rule of law. That's threatening to this guy. And you're not acting like you're supposed to as an ambassador in his country. And he said something really interesting to me. He said, I got on Twitter back then, And I want you to know I'm still on the platform, at least for a while. I got on because my boss at the time, Secretary of State Clinton, told me to get on Twitter. I did not get on Twitter on purpose. I was instructed to get on Twitter because we had a social media thing that the secretary herself was running. She's very proud of that, by the way, and she should be. And he said to me, he said, Mike, you just tweeted a photo with your kids. I was the third grade basketball coach that year. And I just tweeted a photo with me coaching my third grade son in public, interacting with all kinds of other kids and all kinds of other people. He said, have you ever seen a photo of Putin doing that? I said, no, I guess I hadn't. He said, that photo is threatening to the way that he runs his place. So we need to be careful that there's not a conspiracy, but do these ideas threaten him? Yes. Do the NGOs that groups like NED and USAID fund? I would say they're supporting free and fair elections, but if you're afraid of free and fair elections, that's a threat to Putin.
Great. Well, we're going to go to questions, and my last question is actually somebody else's first question here, so that feeds very nicely. And this is for Roman. Well, the question was, how stable is Putin's position? And then I would say, feeding into that, my question is, who's going to be Putin's successor, or is he going to die on the throne?
It's a very interesting question. You know, I've heard so many times from many people, experts, who really believe that Putin is going to die in his chair, and he's not going to give up his presidential power ever, which I believe is a very big misconception, and for a number of reasons. Well, first of all, Putin does understand how his country is managed because he built this regime. And he knows that the power inside the country is divided between various clans. Clans. And these clans have been fighting for resources, power, and the proximity to Putin for many years. And he knows that the moment he dies, or even when he is significantly weakened, you know, the balance of power will change, and the war for power will start. And obviously, he wants to avoid it because he wants his ideology to live for as much as possible and to continue. The second reason why I believe he's not willing to die in his throne is because succession is a very natural and understandable procedure for him, because this is something he went through by himself in 1999. And he obviously believes that it was a great success. Another reason why I believe that he doesn't want to die in his throne is I think that he already sees himself not as a president, but rather as a father of the nation. President is a job, and fathers of the nations don't work. Like, you know, like what you described, you know, they sit on the throne and they just give their will to people on earth so that they do whatever they are told. Then the question is, who's going to be the successor? When we look at the potential candidate, there are many you know, check boxes that need to be filled. First of all, this person should be trusted by Putin, because obviously, you know, you can't let someone rule the country without trust. Secondly, this person should be devoted to Putin, personally devoted to Putin, and he should believe in his ideology. I would also say that this person should not belong to any of the old clans, because then if he does, it will again ruin the balance of power. And last but not least, I think that this person should fit into the image of Russia that Putin is trying to build. Mm-hmm. And in my opinion, in my humble opinion, there is only one person in Russia who actually fits this image today. And this is his ex-bodyguard, whose name is Alexei Dumin. And the reason why I believe that he's the most likely successor is, well, first of all, Dumin worked with Putin for 25 years. Right. He's been with him, you know, during all this time. He saved him in taiga from bears. This is what Dumin, you know, said in an interview. He saved him from drowning in the ocean. And he truly believes in Putin's ideology, and he's devoted to him like a dog. And then this guy has a number of merits. He was the head of Russian special services, which played a crucial role in the annexation of Crimea. And this was the reason why Dumin got the medal of the Hero of Russia. Then he was in charge of the evacuation of Mr. Yanukovych from Ukraine. And there is also, it's very likely that he played a crucial role in making Prigozhin actually stop the military coup in 2023, because they were acquainted with Prigozhin since Dumin's service in the Ministry of Defense, So I believe that most likely we will see in the nearest future, nearest in historical terms, future kind of rule that is split between these two guys. When Dumin is the head of is the president, and Putin is the father of the nation, who is responsible for actually everything. But again, it's only an assumption. I'm not a prophet. I'm just trying to evaluate probabilities.
Have you written that story yet?
I published it, yes. Actually.
Oh,
I published
yesterday.
it. Yeah.
Okay, all the more reason to read iStories. At the end, we will have a QR code where you can go to his site. Okay, we have lots of good questions. This is a great crowd of people. Thank you so much for your smart questions. Okay, how much is Russia suffering from the war and sanctions, suffering economically from the war and sanctions? Do you have a sense?
It depends on what do we mean by suffering. Putin doesn't care that much about how much people suffer. I mean, till a certain point. Poverty is not a big problem for him. Vice versa, it's actually really beneficial for him to have poor people, because then you can, offer them contracts with the Ministry of Defense where they will earn huge money. And I guess what we see and what we hear from people inside the country is that things are more or less okay. Yeah, the prices are high, but people, are kind of getting used to them. And everything is more or less working. There are some signs there are some dangerous signs that, and Putin sees them. He's worried that at one point things might go in a wrong direction, and that is why he needs this break in Ukraine in order to rebuild the army. And he's dreaming about canceling some of the sanctions. But on this stage, unfortunately, I believe everything is more or less working inside the country.
Okay. This is from Michael. This is a more foreign policy question. Is there a possibility that Trump will try to make a grand deal with Xi? Stop aiding Russian-Ukraine war, and then the U.S. won't go to war over Taiwan.
So help me on the contours of the deal.
Okay, is there a possibility Trump will try to make a grand deal
with Xi Jinping?
The idea would be, okay, we won't aid Ukraine.
Okay.
And then, I guess then the U.S. doesn't go to war over Taiwan.
When China invades Taiwan? That's the quid pro quo?
That's right. That's the part that's missing from this, but that's the assumption is that.
Well, I don't know. And I don't trust anybody who answers that question as if they do know.
Okay.
I do think, but there's something, it's an interesting question. And I would just say two things about the pieces of it. Trump will try to do a deal on Ukraine, as we talked about before. And if he succeeds, no, I don't want to speculate. I don't want to speculate. Because if he succeeds, I just saw where I'm going. That's a giant hurdle that I don't predict. But I do think that, as a kind of orthogonal answer, that there's way more uncertainty about how President Trump will react to even coercive power, let alone invasion, vis-a-vis Taiwan, than there was before. He said some things that have been under. I'm writing a book about great power competition right now, out in fall, autocrats versus Democrats, and with my colleagues who work on Taiwan. I'm not an expert on Taiwan, but I have colleagues that are. There is an uncertainty that at the end of the day, these are not things. Trump doesn't really care about Ukraine. And if there was an invasion of Taiwan, would he really want to go to war? And would the American people want to go to war with China over Taiwan? they're nervous that he's not signaling that kind of, even he's not signaling strategic ambiguity. Having said all that, it's just too early. We're like 2 weeks and 2 days in, and we should give them a chance to articulate what their strategy is.
It feels like 2 years and 2 months in, but yes.
Yeah, it feels that way. It definitely feels that way for me too. Yeah.
So there's some questions here about journalism that I want to ask Roman for you to answer. So
I'm a journalist too.
And you as well.
I'm just kidding.
I'm thinking so how has journalism changed or adapted to stand out as relevant in a time when individuals absorb so much information? How can journalism and how has journalism adapted and changed, especially looking at the Ukraine-Russia conflict? What kinds of work have both of you done to help illuminate that situation in a way that people can understand what's really going on? You from both of you. That would be a great question.
Well, it's a big question. The thing is that we as journalists, especially as investigative reporters, we know what is responsibility. We know what is credibility. We care about facts. We sometimes risk to publish those facts. It takes a lot of time, energy. In my old newsroom in Novaya Gazeta, 6 people were killed for doing their job. Simultaneously, with the development of social media, the value of the word has significantly deflated. Now everyone is talking about everything, and people are experts in all kinds of things. It not only deflated the value of the word, it also increased what is called cognitive overload on our brains, which makes it really difficult for people to make decisions because people are, don't know what is true, what is wrong. People are not used to distinguish between facts and opinions. And I don't know the way how we're gonna overcome this obstacle, especially since, social media, big platforms are not our allies. If you look at, what they do, like what Facebook does, with canceling its fact-checking policy, or what Apple does, it deletes apps in Russia of the independent media outlets because Apple is being told to do that by the Kremlin. How ridiculous is that? Imagine if Hitler in 1941 ordered a publishing house called Apple to stop publishing newspapers that were telling the truth about his horrible crimes. Would Apple do that? Well, yeah. If you look at what they do now, they would. I'm really pessimistic about it because I see how journalism is losing this battle. Because we can't afford ourselves to simplify things. We can't just say, Putin is an idiot. He's an idiot, but we can't just write it. We can't just say that we will end up the war in one day. And people who become presidents, say that without even thinking that, you gotta follow your word, right? Because it's your reputation. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, so first of all, I'm not a journalist. I'm a commentator in the media, and there's a big difference, and I want to make sure to emphasize that. I agree with Roman. It's a pessimistic time for me in these battles of disinformation, misinformation, propaganda. When I see, nominees to join our cabinet just literally repeating things that RT has been propagating for years about 50 billion, used to overthrow Yanukovych. And I know that's just not true, and yet we're losing those battles, right? And at least that feels very dispiriting to me. Second, there's a big difference between commentary and reporting, and the fact that those lines are getting blurred all the time, and there's way more commentary and a lot less reporting is not healthy for democracies anywhere. And it's not healthy for science, by the way. And it's not healthy for social science. Like here at Stanford University, we do have experts on places like Russia and Ukraine, and yet in the debate, you know, I'm going to be careful about naming names, but at times I'm asked to debate people that know nothing about Russia, and yet we're supposed to sit on the platform, and I've spent 40 years studying this place, and some tech guy who's active on Twitter
Right.
And by the way, don't invite those people to be on your platforms. That's on us too, by the way. We do that. That happens to me all the time by sometimes media groups, and I just think we gotta have some in our own choices. We gotta not do that. And then the third thing I would just emphasize: our social media companies are part of this. Please read the piece that Yulia Navalnaya and Volodya Karmurza and Ilya Yashin published yesterday in the Washington Post about how this is all intertwined and constrains people like Roman and others who are trying to get information into Russia. That all said, I do think it's a fight worth fighting. I published a piece in the Dispatch today, my first time ever publishing in that medium. I don't know them that well, but somebody said, "What are you doing publishing in this right-wing media, Mike?" And it's like, well, I'm going to be engaged wherever I can be. And I would say in certain instances, I've seen where really great investigative reporting coupled with commentary can help produce positive outcomes. And the one that comes to mind for me was the fight we had here in my country, in the United States, about whether to do a new assistance package to Ukraine. And that was a battle. And it was a battle. I work for NBC and MSNBC, and I can tell you it was a battle whether we're going to cover that story or not, right? Because people are tired. Mike, I'm not going to name, you know, who said that. People are tired of listening to the war. But no, there were some really important, creative producers of some of our shows that said, no, people in America need to know about this war, and we're going to figure out more creative ways to do it. And our reporters did, and we relied on other reporters, and then, you know, other commentators, and eventually we won that battle. And I don't know if we'll will again, but without great reporting coupled with activists, you know, Americans that said this is the right thing to do, that would have not have happened. And by the way, when we finally got a vote, it was not even close, folks. It was not even close. It was like 2/3, 1/3. But it took that pressure, that constant pressure of reporting plus commentary to get us to that vote.
So we have this stage is coming down, the screen is coming down because it's going to have your ability to do a QR code with your phone of iStories. So we have time for just a final comment or two comment from each of you. If you have anything, I think, Mike, that was a great ending one, unless you have another thought.
My final comment is I'm just in awe of people like you. It's easy for me to punt. Well, I got my troubles with the Trump folks too, but not compared to what these people like Roman are doing and what you personally are doing, and whatever you can do to support these courageous people, because I got a better idea. I am in awe. It is a privilege to get to know people like Roman, but I want to say one last thing about his incredibly great analysis of life after Putin. I'm not an expert anymore on those kind of things, and we should all read your piece. But that was great, brilliant analysis. I have no reason to dispute it. The only thing I would say is that's just the first play, right? Doesn't mean it's the last play in Russia. And I would say one thing about history and one thing about some incredibly brave Russians I know, including you. One is, I lived in the Soviet Union. I actually think you weren't even alive back then, 1983. Of course you were not alive.
I was alive.
I'm dating myself. I lived in the Soviet Union when my colleague from Russia was not even born. And back then, it was a period of Zastoy, folks. It was the Brezhnev era, Andropov came, Chernenko. It was all that. It was very depressing. Nobody predicted that there would ever be change. And then the next time I lived in the Soviet Union was 1985, the year Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. Nobody in 83 was predicting that Gorbachev was going to be around in 85. There were two other leaders in between, right? The Dumans of the world. But that was not predicted. Likewise, it was not predicted by anybody, including me, that 6 years later the Soviet Union would collapse after that event. And I could tell the same story about Stalin to Khrushchev. In other words, we're not good, and you rightly with modesty, because you're a journalist, not a pontificator like us. I'm a social scientist too, but we're not making predictions about the future because we can't predict. We don't know the outcome, but I know from Russian and Soviet history that it's not inevitable that 20 years from now, Putinism in its current form will still exist. In fact, I actually think it's improbable. And while there are still courageous Russians that believe in alternative Russia, we should do what we can to support them. And there are those courageous Russians in the world today, and one of them's on our stage right now.
Great.
Thank you.
Do you want to say anything else?
What can I say after such a speech? First of all, it's easy. I mean, thank you very much. I guess what I'd like to say is a couple of words about my team. I mean, it's easy to be brave when you are in the US at Stanford. But, I really admire my team because the majority of them are young women, younger than 30. We have even a couple of cases in my newsroom when the reporters don't talk to their parents because their parents think that they're traitors because they left Russia. Mm. And when I remember myself when I was 25, and I'm asking myself whether I would do the same, whether I would leave the country and whether I would, have such a dispute with my parents, I'm not sure that I would do the same. And not only they made such a difficult decision, I really admire the way they work, they investigate, by using all their coding skills and other brilliant skills to find facts that they publish. One of my colleagues, she's working now on a story when she's trying to build an algorithm that will count the casualties of Russians automatically by scraping all the data from various social media platforms. But in order to prove the concept, she has to look at the photos of dead Russian soldiers, and she calculated that in a week, she had to look at more than 1,000 pictures of dead soldiers, and still, she's doing her job. So they are the main heroes for me, and I'm really proud that I work with these amazing people. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I just want to close by saying thank you to all of you for being here tonight. This is an important event. I'm really glad that you were all here to hear the conversation. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Roman. Thank you, our other Russian fellow who is here with us, Mike, and all of our fellows and our board. So thank you, and we will have a video of this event posted. I'll ask the Bechtel folks when next week. We'll have a video posted, and please do follow iStories. It's a great site, and thank you, and good night.